Greetings, Earthlings. Today we're going to talk about reading great books. Pardon me if I occasionally look down at my notes, and so let's get started. Okay, so we're going to go over some tips and exercises. Now I know there's not much, I don't want to repeat a lot of obvious stuff, so I want to try to give you a few maybe things you didn't consider. So let's go over the obvious stuff first really quickly. There's a ton of benefits to reading, especially reading great books. It develops your imagination, inspiration, ideas. It helps your reading and writing. It can serve as, the author can serve as a role model, or characters can serve as role models. So we can get into issues of morality, vocabulary, phrases, grammar. You can learn all this stuff from reading. So I'm not going to really dwell on that. Punctuation, a ton of stuff. However, not all books are created equal, and also how should we even approach reading a book? So the goal of this video is going to be twofold, which is to give you guys an idea of suggestions like which books should you be reading, and two, once you pick a book or you're in the middle of a book, how do you get the most out of it? Okay, so first, a common misconception. So this is misconception number one, is that reading is a passive activity. So sometimes we read out loud like in a class, but when we're reading to ourselves, we're reading quietly, so it may feel really passive, like not much is going on, we're sort of just like moving our heads through the reading. Reading is an intensely active activity, so it involves, you're listening to, imagine the author is actually there in your living room or in the classroom, they're actually talking to you and you're listening. So to get the most out of it, it takes a lot of focus and concentration, so it's not a passive activity. Now, one of my favorite tips, and I used to be guilty of this myself very much, which is don't rush through the book. I used to think like the faster I have read a chapter of a book, the bigger my badge of honor. So it can be quite enjoyable to just, like even books that I would just race through them, and I didn't get as much enjoyment. So, you don't have to rush through a book. Try to savor it and, heaven forbid, even think about what the author has, like either the world they've created or the thoughts. You don't have to agree with him or her, but really contemplate. So like what I like to do is if I've hit a moment in a book that I find really interesting, whether it's controversial or I agree with it or profound, I like to close the book for a second and just pause and think about that, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes or longer. All right. So, and that, there's actually, I can recommend a book, for some of you, there's a book called Thinking as a Science. It's a really old, it's not a really popular book, but it's an old book, and I'll put it in the description to the video. And it mentions some of these points about just thinking, thinking for fun. Now, another thing, vocabulary. So in the previous video, we talked about tips how to build your vocabulary, and reading is one of those great things where it's a natural way to build your vocabulary. So if you're pressed for time, you can like get a book and try to learn hundreds of words, but a much better route is just to read a lot. But make sure when you're reading, if you come across words you don't know, you're looking them up, you're maybe have a notebook, and you're really not just saying like, oh, I think it means that, and moving on. Even if you just make a note of it and come back to it later. So it's a very natural way to learn vocabulary as well as phrasing, like learn advanced phrasing. Now, I really want to talk about priming. So this is something I talked about in the last 2 videos in terms of learning vocabulary. So we talked about this in terms of reading comprehension and vocabulary. Okay, so let's say you want to read something, and in advance, I gotta pay attention to what the detective says. In that case, you're gonna learn and pick up much more about what the detective says than if you're just reading randomly, and then after the fact I asked you, hey, what did the detective say, or like what happened in the scenes with the detective? So if you're aware of if you're primed to what you're looking for, you're gonna get much more out of your reading. So like oftentimes in school, you're just asked to read a book, and hopefully by osmosis, you pick something up. So that's what I talk about when I say fun versus a purpose. So you're probably going to miss a lot if you're not reading with a purpose. Now, unless you're reading for fun, and that's great too. So sometimes you just want the author to lead you and let the story wash over you and get a holistic general understanding of what you're reading. That could be a great thing too. But here I'm talking about reading comprehension in the context like of a school class or an exam or something where you're expected to, you want to be able to perform something specific, or you want to be able to answer questions after you're done reading. However, to be frank, one can argue that all or almost all reading should be fun, because when you're reading, you're going to be much more receptive and likely to learn more if you find it fun. But the point I want to make is you want to have a purpose. It's like if you're reading for school and you know that, they might, I might be asked to write an essay about why this friendship failed or worked or whatever, then you want to start your reading with that purpose in mind. If you just read it passively and randomly, you're less likely to recall what happened. So you may want to go back to the previous videos on priming and check that out. So that's all I'll say, that, which is knowing what you're looking for prior to reading will help you retain more than if you just read randomly and then you hope you just recalled everything. If you're confused, by the way, please ask. I'll be happy to answer questions in the comments, so feel free to ask. All right, let's talk about a few exercises. There's so many exercises you can do. I'm not even going to attempt to cover all of them. So here are just like a few that I like, some of my favorite ones. All right, so one is pick out 3 to 5 elements of the author's style that you liked in the book. So for example, let's say it's a Mark Twain book, and maybe you liked his use of colloquialisms, for example, in his book Tom Sawyer. And then you find 3 to 5 instances of that and specific passages to support what you found. Number 2, find 10 spots in the book indicating the mood, and then find 10 spots indicating the tone, or maybe half and half. They're not the same thing. We won't go over the distinction between them. And here's the critical part, which is tell us why you think the author was so effective in conveying that mood or tone in those parts. What about their word usage? What do they do? What techniques do they use? This is really getting inside of the reading. So why were they so effective? It's very easy, it's relatively easy to just find these, but I want you to think about why did they do this effectively? Or you could say ineffectively if you don't like the book, you think the author did a poor job. Now, one of my favorites is number 3. So let's say you really like the book, create a scene in the style of the author. It could be a scene at the end of the book or in the middle, and so anything. You can even add extra characters, really anything. Here's the cool part. So bonus points if you can make it so good that a person who's never read the book can't tell whether it's your writing or the author's writing. So if it blends, so let's say here's the original, you have like scene 1, then you add your scene 2, and then there's scene 3 in the book. So if a person reading all 3 can't tell which one of them is yours, or even between like a scene in the book and your book, between 2 of them, then you really did a great job. So that's like one nice way to tell. Ask your friend, hey, which of these did I write and which of these came from the book? If they can't tell, you did a great job. All right. Now, misconception number 2. There's a lot of recommendations as to which books are great, which books are not so great, which books are advanced, and so forth. And one thing I want to get across is that this notion of good versus bad books is very misleading. So, in fact, it doesn't even make any sense. So, what would need to add to this for it to make sense is the notion of what feature we're talking about. So, for example, a book can be great in terms of its advanced word usage. So maybe, for example, like a James Joyce book for some of the older high school kids. A James Joyce book, his collection of short stories, Dubliners, has a lot of advanced word usage and phrasing, so that could be great for that. Or maybe a book is good for comedy or suspense or sentimentality or world creation. Otherwise, you're just comparing apples to oranges. So like an English teacher might think that Lord of the Rings sucks, right? But many kids who love fantasy books and world creation, they love Lord of the Rings because they like that element. So an English teacher might be looking at word usage and the kid is looking at fantasy and imagination. So you can't compare those two elements. So there might be Of Mice and Men. So if you're looking for like John Steinbeck and Of Mice and Men, if you want a writer with like a nice, clean, very short writing style, very to the point, that could be a great example of that. But if you're looking for long, flowing passages, that would be a terrible choice. Then you have something like The Phantom Tollboth. It's really great as an imagination book. It's great for learning about puns. It's a very punny book. There's Flowers for Algernon. It's a very interesting writing style. I don't want to give it away, but if you're reading it for the wrong reason, you'll say it's a great book or a bad book. You might have another book, A Separate Peace, which it has the idea perhaps of an unreliable narrator. Or let's say One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We already talked about Lord of the Rings for its world creation, fantasy. And there's many other definitive classics and modern books. The idea is, why are you reading a book? If you're reading a book just for fun, that's cool. But if you're reading it for class and someone's telling you, so a parent, or you want to know what's a good book, what's a bad book, I recommend asking for what purpose. For building your vocabulary, for learning the writing style, for creative development. So then it makes a little more sense to give recommendations as to like, this book will help you in this area more than that book. So that's what I want to leave you guys with, that otherwise you're comparing apples and oranges. Hopefully that was helpful. I'll see you guys in the next video.